Hi there, and welcome to Zero to Civ. This is the teacher workshop for the introductory unit, where we talk about the Finnish method. Effectively, the point of Zero to Civ is that it will be an open source teacher's toolkit, something that can be used to break down from an engineering perspective the very best practices to be found worldwide in education. We're starting with the Finnish method, in part because that's what I've been focused on for the last few years, and in part because the successes that have been found in Finland have been extremely highly reputed the world over for some years, and there have been numerous attempts to export those ideas and concepts, many unsuccessful attempts. But in order to get a better look at exactly why things work in Finland, we've put together this material. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope that you're interested enough to look at the adjoining materials, including the parents video and the student videos on a sustainable future, our introductory lesson, which ties to the Create Your Own Sustainability project. So if you're a teacher checking this out, please feel free to reach out to us, get us any feedback that you think is worthwhile. If you think that there is a specific school system or practice that is used somewhere in the world that is worth looking into, let us know, because in the long run, this is meant to start incorporating a lot of the concepts that can be found worldwide to provide best practices to teachers no matter where they are on the planet. Again, this is open source, so it only gets better if people contribute and take part. Please enjoy, and I hope you're able to get something worthwhile out of it. My name is Paul Nix. I'm the founder of the Time Repair Corporation. We're a small sustainability and educational consulting firm focused on the idea of combating globally scaled problems with empowerment and education. We're attempting to do that through Zero to Civ by focusing on empowerment and by providing people solid roles that they can fit into, whether they're a parent, teacher, student, or simply a community member. So we'll go ahead and get started right away. The first thing that people may ask is about Finland itself. Because of course, Finland has an exceptional reputation. And of course, we've seen lots of different educational attempts that claim to talk about Finnish methodology. What I'm putting together here is not a silver bullet. It's not the secret to making the Finnish method work. What it is a breakdown of the Finnish successes that have been had from a systemic point of view and ways that they could be implemented in other parts of the world. So let's dig into it directly. Finland, as you may know, is sandwiched in the north of Europe between Russia on one side and Sweden and the Baltic on the other. And since the end of World War II, they have invested extremely in their own population, in parents, in workers, in teachers, in students. They have made amazing amounts of social programs that have focused on worker rights, on a shorter work week, on better wages, on better respect and training for teachers, on warm meals and support for students. In fact, it's commonly considered that to be born in Finland is to have won a sort of lottery because of the amount of social services, the education, and everything else going for you when you exist in this society. I've been here for about 10 years now, and during a lot of that time, I've spent it studying schools, education, and the ways to teach. My background is engineering, so I've been looking at it from a slightly different perspective to most. And unlike a lot of people who are either looking at the educational system from inside Finland their entire lives, or from outside Finland trying to figure out what's been done, I've seen a lot of problems coming from the lack of perspective that one side or the other might have. Effectively, if you were raised in Finland, you don't really know firsthand what's going on in other places. Even if you study other educational systems, it may not be completely apparent to you. And if you're coming from outside of Finland, You may, as many have, end up fixating on the first thing that you notice that is drastically different about the Finnish educational system. For example, play is education. This is something that a lot of people end up trying to take back and copy-paste into other places, and they don't experience the same kind of successes. It's not a bad thing necessarily to notice these differences, but if they're all you look at and you assume that they're the difference that matters, you can miss the big picture. So, all of that support for education, for students, for parents, for workers, for teachers, all of it has been invested in for decades. And from the perspective that I've been able to develop here, this has been the key to those successes. Investment is the simple and plain explanation. Parents are invested in the success of their children. Teachers are invested in the success of their students. Students are invested in their educational process. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail here. So when we talk about investment, it's not just monetary, because if it were completely monetary, then the only way that you could replicate Finnish successes somewhere else would be effectively to replicate the societal environment in which those successes happened. You would have to do amazing amounts of change in a lot of different governmental and political systems in order to get that kind of investment in education, in workers, in teachers, in parents. But by looking at things slightly from another perspective, we can look at the way people invest their time and energy as individuals, and we can put together a sort of community guideline for how people can invest that time and energy in a way that shows the value of those different social systems, in a way that allows for the kind of political change in the long term that can provide longer term investments. This is part of what we're looking at, is long-term change and comprehensive investments. And the educational system that has worked here in Finland so effectively has been extremely purpose-driven and role-oriented, in which parents, teachers, students, and community members all have very specific roles to play. For example, the parent of a Finnish child has a very different mindset when it comes to the purpose of education. And this is one of the most important questions to ask. What is the purpose of education? Teachers tend to ask this question, but not a lot of other people in society ask it anywhere near enough. And parents and students hardly ask it at all. The purpose of education, so far as I've come to understand it in Finland, is to produce adults who are well-rounded, active, and participatory citizens in their political process and their communities. Effectively, you are producing people who can ask questions, who can take care of themselves and their responsibilities, and who can continue a society that values social mobility. This is a big difference from, for example, North America, where I went to school myself, where primarily the impression that I've gotten, not only throughout my own childhood, throughout my young adulthood, and throughout my time working in educational companies, the idea there seems to be more that parents are consumers who have perhaps not bought a product, but who still expect to be able to complain to a manager if things aren't exactly up to their expectations from day one. Now, as teachers, I'm sure you can all understand exactly how detrimental that can be to your classroom, to the idea of communicating with your students about their future or about their ability to change the world. So this is one of the main purposes we have in mind, is to communicate with parents who were involved in our programs to communicate to them that their role is the role of an advisor, someone who asks the student about their day and who is invested in the success of their student, but not someone who's guiding that process directly. You're not managing it. You are acting as an advisor. So if the student has a question, or if the student has let the parent know, I'm studying space, for example, then the parent can come in and say, you know what, I have a little time this afternoon after dinner. Would you like to watch this latest documentary on stellar phenomena from Netflix? It's a way that parents can invest their time and energy that starts to not only broaden the student's exposure to the subject matter, but also demonstrates that they value the education that the student is participating in, and the school, and the teachers. This is a way to instill into that student's mind and to further demonstrate for that student that the school, the teacher, the class material are interesting and are worth their time. Knowing, even subconsciously, that their parents respect those institutions and respect that material makes the material more interesting to students. It also helps to strengthen the bond between parent and student, which can become taxed if the parent always feels the need to already know all of the subject matter, or if the parent feels the risk of potentially being wrong about a subject, which is a very real phenomenon. The point is not to always have the right answer, but to be able to find the right answer when you don't know everything. And this is something that can be reinforced for parents through students and through this program. So, ideally, we can put together a system in which the student has a role, which is to manage their own educational process, and we'll go into that in significant detail. The parent has a role to be an advisor, and the teacher has a role. In this case, we'll have a closer look at that teacher role. The role of a teacher in Finland is generally that of an overall guide, someone who introduces a subject, introduces the topic that is going to be covered, and then encourages students to start digging into the material in any way that makes sense to them, encourages group assignments, encourages student-led projects, and does not have to worry necessarily about micromanaging everything going on in their classroom. This is a huge difference from the way that I experienced school myself as a student. The idea in Finland is that, for example, if a student needs to use the restroom, they don't raise their hand and say, "Sir, may I be excused?" It's not done. Instead, the student quietly gets up, makes their way to the bathroom on their own. There are no hall passes, there's nothing else, and they come back and get back to work. If the student needs to have a snack to maintain their blood sugar, fantastic. They do it. And they tend to do it quietly and effectively and get back to work. I know this may seem a little bit different from your idea of a classroom, and maybe it doesn't. Ideally, it doesn't. This idea of tasking the student with the responsibility for guiding their educational process ends up having this side effect that the students end up being more responsible for it. Teachers may wear jeans. They may wear tennis shoes. It's not a shirt and tie every day. But the teacher is addressed on a first name basis. They are treated, and the students are also treated very much like equals by one another. It's a conversation, and introducing something like that could potentially cause a degree of chaos. It's not expected to be something that works overnight, but it's something that can be introduced in steps. The responsibility on the student's shoulders can be introduced bit by bit. And that's part of the idea behind Zero to Civ, is to find ways to make that as simple as possible. So let's talk a little bit more about being student-centric and about the student as the responsibility holder for their education. We've talked a little bit about the roles for parents and teachers. We've talked a little bit about the purpose of education. So let's talk about the student themselves. When a student enters a classroom, they have expectations in their mind. If they're expecting a confrontation, they will find a way to escalate a confrontation. This is just how students are. But if they're expecting material that is challenging, they're going to rise to that challenge. If they're expecting that parents and teachers are just as excited about the subject matter as they may be, then they're going to be outwardly as excited as they want to be about the subject. And this is kind of key, especially from a young age. Students already start, children effectively start, being enraptured with science, with history. If you talk about pirates, if you talk about mummies, if you talk about bugs and dinosaurs and any other wild animals, you will find you have a student's attention. If you give them a way to do research and become an expert on something, on just about anything, as you will know if you've ever asked a student or child about their favorite Pokemon, they can go on for hours about the material in amazing detail. I myself, when I was a student, was extremely fixated on things like genetics and how viruses worked and all kinds of other minutiae when it came to mechanics or the structure of the human body. It was a fascination, but all students have fascinations. By being able to tie those fascinations into the subject matter, any way at all, by encouraging those students to take the lead and to make these connections themselves, where if they are interested, for example, in drones, great. Find a way to connect that to the science, the mathematics, the history, the art that they're already studying. This is the real key. Now, the role of the student, as we have said, is to manage their own educational process. Effectively, this is done by a teacher, by sitting down with the students and letting them know that they're going to be taking the lead. Here are the outcomes that we want to get to. We're going to be studying these subjects, and you're going to have to be able to do these things at the end of it. How you get there is going to have some flexibility. And that's, again, completely up to you, the way you want to structure things. The way that you work best as teachers makes a huge difference, because your excitement, your energy, your love for the subject is something that will bleed through, and ideally can bleed through. Again, one of the reasons that I want to focus on the Finnish successes is because overall, despite the amazing PISA scores that come out of Finland, they're not just about students scoring well on the test as far as academics. They're also concerned with student well-being and how well-balanced and happy and emotionally set the students are. And these are things that end up being many times ignored throughout North America, throughout other parts of the world. And that's just culturally different. It's something that can be changed, though, depending on the values that we have for that system. So let's talk a little bit about pedagogy. A lot of the things that you may see in the listing here, they may have the same names as programs and styles that are used in regions that you work in, regions that you have worked in or lived in. Effectively, these are not necessarily new concepts. A lot of the concepts used in Finnish pedagogy have been developed in other parts of the world and are still used in other parts of the world. So you end up with the question about the values behind them, and about how they are being done in Finland to get such different results. So, project-based education. I'm sure that you already understand, but just for the sake of argument, being able to take a topic and focus in a group of students, not in a way that it's a standard group assignment and one person will bear all the load and everyone else will maybe slack off, but in a way in which the students are responsible for different components in the project and they assess each other and how useful those contributions were in the group. This is something that can be extremely valuable. Of course, as a teacher, you should be watching how they interact and taking your own assessments. But in this way, you have much more collaborative group work. And I was not a fan of group work myself as a student. But ideally, this is something that can help focus on complex questioning. The multidisciplinary or phenom-based approach you may have heard of as well, in which you have, again, perhaps a more complex subject, something with a lot of gray area. For example, climate change. If you were to look at it, of course there's no gray area in the science behind it, but the cultural response to the concept has been much more complex than anyone would have ever expected. When I was young myself, it was referred to as global warming. But of course, we've moved on in our science since then. The fact that there is any question as to the validity of it, well, there's not really. There's no question. It's a thing. But the fact that there has been so much societal response and political division over it, that's something that could use some attention. So by taking a subject like that and looking at it through the realm of social sciences, history, through the realm of art, through the realm of science and mathematics, of course, by looking at that one topic from a lot of different angles and challenging the students to look into exactly why there's a problem, why there are questions, letting them find their own resources, letting them dig into this from a lot of different angles, you really sort of light a spark for independent inquiry. And it's part of what's needed in our societies worldwide. We need to have, for example, a healthy respect for journalism again, and students who might want to actually grow up and be journalists. You get that through independent inquiry. You get that through research. And you get that through empowering students to start digging into these topics and really take critical views, to defend their opinions, to admit if they've got something wrong, and understand that there are no permanent wrong answers. If you find something that doesn't have evidence supporting it, it's something where you should be able to say, you know what? Maybe I should look a little bit harder at the evidence and the amount of evidence on one side or the other. This is part of the success of the Finnish system. Finns raise students who are more likely to question a topic from a lot of different angles, even if they're quiet about it. Of course, the blended classroom and the flipped learning approach are things that are well known, and there are plenty of resources on them, so we don't need to go into too much detail on them. But the idea of making the class time useful for what it is most useful for, and especially during times of social isolation, let's say, it's extremely important to use the time that you have with students to focus on the socialization aspects, the things that can only be done in a group of their peers. That's the real value of the school as time moves forward, because an awful lot can be done with the flipped learning approach, in which students are empowered to do their own research at home. That's part of what they do before they come to the class to discuss. And if they haven't been able to do that, then they end up suffering for it. And it's part of building that responsibility for them and having that communication clearly between teacher and student. Depending on the age of your students, this can be something that takes a little bit of work and a little bit of getting used to. But there are a lot of rewards to be had from looking at simple pedagogies like this and employing them in a way that puts the ball clearly in the student's court. So I have a short activity that I'd like some of you to take a little bit of time for. Now, if you're watching this alone, then, and of course, I'd love for you to share the video anyway, but please involve a colleague, involve a friend, involve someone you know. Ideally, you share the video and they watch up to this point, you've paused, and then the two of you can work on this together, at least two of you. But if I were running the workshop directly at your school or for your teachers group regionally, this is what I would have you focus on for at least 20 minutes. I would want you to break into groups, ideally with people you haven't really worked with, ideally people with different perspectives, different teaching methods. Introduce yourselves, where you come from, what you're about, and then start looking at ways to introduce not only the finished pedagogy, but also this perspective into your classrooms and into your teaching. Put together a lesson where you are assigning roles and responsibilities, not just for your students, but also for any fellow teachers, any parents who might be involved, so that everyone in the community has an understood role and responsibility. This is key. And then, once you've put together the lesson, ideally, all of the different groups of teachers would present their lessons to one another and discuss them with the group, see what they can do to strengthen the ideas. Effectively, this is a game. And one of the most important things that I can stress is to play, have fun, make mistakes, and enjoy the process, even as a teacher, because students see these things and they judge accordingly. So, pause the video, take some time, even if it is by yourself, and put together the rudiments of a lesson, ideally in a format that you can introduce to a colleague to get some notes on, see what their opinion is, and let me know. If you find something really interesting, that'd be fantastic to hear about. Go ahead and look me up, timerepaircorp.com, or any social media you can think of. You'll find me around, Paul Nix. But for now, take a minute. Ideally, you've had plenty of time to pause and get through some lesson work, and I hope that this process has been at least somewhat enjoyable. But let's move right along with the presentation and talk a little bit more in depth about those values that I mentioned. Now, in order to make a system like Finland's educational system work, you end up needing those investments that I talked to. But those investments only happened because of societal values. The nation of Finland effectively has a very strong reputation for valuing equality, social mobility, access to education, to resources, to support if it's needed. They value their environment, very much like my own home of California. And they're willing to not only invest time and energy in it, but they also are close enough to it generally, even in major cities like Helsinki, that they can just go and take a walk in the woods during lunch and then be back in the classroom quickly. That's not something that can be replicated everywhere, but the value for the environment is and can be. They've also got an exceptional focus on the concept of not only a balanced and strong work ethic, but a balance between that work ethic and rewards for hard work. The idea is that effectively everybody works hard, and at the end of the work week, you turn off. You don't look at your email. You don't answer work cell phone calls. You take that time to unwind, recuperate. You take that time for yourself. The idea of having people work during their own time is a little bit foreign in Finland. There are, of course, people who have inherited the standard US method of workaholism, but effectively, there's an expectation that your rewards are balanced with what you're putting into things, and that everybody gets a decent basic level of reward, regardless of what they're doing. So, when you've got these values behind your system, one of the beautiful things you have are parents who aren't worried about living paycheck to paycheck, students who aren't hungry, teachers who aren't worried that, if the washing machine breaks down this month, I'm not going to have enough to be able to replace it. All of these things are distractions. So putting together a society that is more equitable, that is more socially supported, that has strong communities is something valuable. So, of course, we can't snap our fingers and make wages better everywhere, but we can start to recognize that the values in the Finnish educational system are not inherent and that they aren't a silver bullet. They're something that took work, and that work came in the form of the investments that have been made over time. It's not something people get for free. I always hear people talk about, if you got college for free, but no one here gets college for free. No one here gets education for free. It's something that is invested in through tax dollars. And you know what? Back when I was living in North America, between the California state and federal taxes, it was pretty close to the same rate that I end up paying here in Finland, from value-added taxes, from the taxes that are taken out of a paycheck. It's not that different, except I see where the investments are going, and I'm happy to invest in the education of everyone's students because they make a better society. It's that simple. So, when you're in the classroom as well, focusing on these values it's absolutely essential. Whatever values you hold yourself, make sure that they are front and center. If it's something like equality or a basic degree of justice, that everybody gets a fair shake. That's the idea behind equality. That people can come in and work hard and have opportunities. That's all it is. So you put that into the education. You make sure that people are getting access. You make sure that you're taking time, not just for yourself, but also for the students to look at nature, the environment, at the world around them. And more, student concerns seem to be focused on sustainability issues. So this is key. And you also look at finding ways to balance out, in any way you can, that work ethic and reward. Finding ways to help things and balance things for parents, for the community overall. This is something that teachers are uniquely positioned for in many parts of the world as sort of community centers. You are the connection between all of those students and their parents and one another, in effect. So, let's talk a little bit about soft skills. These are the 7 Finnish core competencies that pretty much all of the pedagogic material in this country are built on. If you're putting together a lesson plan, if it's going to get into national curriculum, it has taken all of these things into consideration. And again, these are not necessarily novel concepts. A lot of them exist in other places, but just to go through them briefly. The first and most important in my mind is thinking and learning how to learn. Effectively, this was covered when I was a student as a critical thought. The ability to question, the ability to look into things, but just as much as that, it's something that is essential for students, especially now that we're really becoming more aware of things like overall neurodiversity, to be able to encourage the student to look at the material and to look at their unique attributes. Because all of that different neurodiversity didn't just occur by chance. It's something that's spread out well enough in our populations that it had some kind of selective benefit, or it wouldn't be there. ADD and ADHD? Honestly, we should consider it a little bit strange if there's a member of our population that can comfortably sit in a chair for 8 hours staring at a wall and focusing the entire time on only that. If your students are more active, great. Get them up, start them dancing, start them doing things as they work through the material, and they will learn effectively. If nothing else, encourage them to think about the best way that they learn. This is something that you may see in a Finnish school, is you may see groups of students outside of the classroom sitting in groups far away from each other, effectively not being supervised, but working on their assignments in different ways. Those group projects we talked about, students handle those in ways that work best for them. That's part of the idea of thinking and learning how to learn. Once the student has been empowered by learning that it's okay that they think and learn the way that they do, and to make the most of it. If the classroom's too quiet and you need to step outside and just clear your head for a moment, being able to do that as a student is priceless. Then you come back in and you get back to work, or find some other way to make things work. Next, we have cultural competence, interaction, and self-expression. Now, this is really important, partially because of the second part of neurodiversity, which is diversity. Everyone in a classroom has a different experience, a different background, a different idea of how the world works, even just when it comes to gender. Experiences can be vastly different, and that may not be ideal, but it is the truth. By being able to focus students not only on how best to express their own viewpoints, but also how to interact and listen to the viewpoints of others, to support one another to the point where they and their classmates can actually discuss things. It ends up having massive benefits, and this is something that actually translates into the working world later on. There have been studies done that show that more diverse workplaces benefit significantly. They get more revenue and they get higher productivity. Encouraging this young is a recipe for success, not just in the short term in the classroom, but in the long term for your students. Next, taking care of oneself, managing daily activities and safety. This one may seem kind of basic, but it is the key to setting responsibility onto the shoulders of the students. This is something that has started at young ages, and I've been told that there are classrooms that some of my acquaintances who are teachers have been in which very young students, maybe first grade or younger, are working with great big needles doing sewing. They're supervised, but they're given sharps and they're allowed to work at the handicraft. It's responsibility. They're told, don't hurt yourselves. Of course, don't hurt anyone else, but this is how it's used and you can do something with it. And these are up to you, not to hurt yourself. Later on in studies, you see grade schoolers from time to time wandering out in the forest with nothing but a map, a compass, and maybe a friend or two. Of course, they probably got cell phones on them, but they're expected to go out, do this, find their way from point A to point B, and be back by a certain time. This is fairly standard. It's a degree of responsibility, not just for themselves, but for one another. If someone is hurt, they all know and understand that the first thing they should do is reach out and get support, advice, or help if it's needed. But effectively, they're given the tools to do that. So, next we can look at multiliteracy education, and we briefly talked about that earlier. The idea of approaching complex subjects from multiple directions and really digging into them, really looking at what it means, a subject, from a lot of different angles, and looking at something like modular design and prototyping from the perspective of history, from the perspective of art, mathematics, can be powerful. If you're taking a project like creating a small business and you start to look at it from these different angles, you get really amazing results. And it's fascinating to see. I can highly recommend this. I've actually been through several programs here where I've gotten to work directly with students who are building their own business and doing other things. And it's amazing the kind of work that they come up with, just in their groups. Next is ICT competence, or IT competence, where I come from. And this is just talking about technology, but it's a little bit more than that. We're not just talking about new technologies like 3D printing or augmented reality, which can be gone into in significant detail, but we're also talking about online addiction, cyberbullying, emotional health, and setting boundaries for oneself. Actually being critical and looking into the different sources for material online. If you've gone through Wikipedia, they've always got their sources listed, but not everybody else does. If you end up with a student who's getting all of their information from naturalnews.com or something else, it may not have the best scientific backing to the material. Whether or not you agree with the sentiments, what matters in a lot of cases is the veracity of the information. And this is part of what's gone into with ICT competence. It's a way for people to grow and not only learn how those tools work, but also learn respect for time away from the screen and how to use non-ICT tools in conjunction with those tools in order to maximize benefits. We have then competence required for working life and entrepreneurship. I, being an entrepreneur, have an opinion about it, but even if you're not necessarily a fan of the general economic environment of business-centric North America, for example, that's fine. This is about teaching those students how to look at a project in a way that can make it viable, whether it's going to become a business or an NGO or just a larger community project. This is where they can start to look into those competences and start working toward them to see if this is something that seems like a good fit for them later in life. And as I said when we were talking about multiliteracy just a few moments ago, I've seen some amazing work done by some extremely young students focused on creating their own businesses. Work that has focused on the business being self-sustaining, paying people salaries, providing a value for the community, and taking care of waste. I mean, amazing ideas. And this is what it's about, effectively, is having students come together and utilize their strengths in order to put together something that would be viable in the real world, and ideally involving members of the community who can come in and talk to the students about their own experiences, maybe even render advice if it's something where the students would love to be able to actually start this project. And this is part of why the adjoining activity for the student introduction, Sustainable Future, is the Create Your Own Sustainability Project workshop, in which the whole idea is that students will work through these basic skills in order to be able to ideate a sustainability project that matters to them and actually start it in their own community. Again, feel free to look into that, but first we'll finish out what we're doing. Last, we've got participation, involvement, and building a sustainable future. And this is probably my favorite, of course, for reasons. The idea that failing is not really a failure so long as you're learning something. This is absolutely essential. Stigmatizing a wrong answer, I think, was one of the greatest failures in my own education as a young person. The idea that you can't learn something is crazy, because anyone can learn just about anything if they're incentivized, if they're motivated. And if they are empowered to do it. This participation and involvement is focused on precisely that. And of course, building a sustainable future is linked to it as well, because that one amazing individual that is going to come up and solve these problems, we don't know who that is. We've got to be able to get people involved and to empower them to a degree that they believe in themselves enough to take chances and try things and fail. Fail repeatedly, fail gloriously, until finally they start to see something different, to enjoy the process of the attempt, the journey. That's part of what this is about. And so being able to dig into that subject matter in a way that lets them start to address what it is that matters to them. If they want to strike for the climate, more power to them. Quite honestly, that may be exactly what the world needs. But if they want to start creating that future themselves, that's where the power is. And that's what I want to see students doing. So hopefully you're in exactly the same boat and you want to see the same sort of thing. I'm looking forward to seeing the world that they put together. Now, we have one more activity that I would like you to work with a group on. Yes, again, I'm doing that. We've already done that once, but you know the drill. Find somebody to work with. Introduce yourselves. Look at roadblocks for your lessons, for adopting some of these finished concepts, for getting the message across to parents in a way that doesn't seem threatening. How are you going to do it? What kind of problems are going to come up? And start looking not just in general, but according to your school, your region. And maybe that's different from your colleague or the person you're working with. That's okay. Work with both. Find solutions together and be creative about it. One of my favorite games is one that I introduced to the students in the second session of the Sustainable Future unit. It's the problem solution game, in which one person, who is generally a bit of an optimist, now has to take on the role of pessimist and come up with a problem that relates to what you're doing. And the other person, ideally who is usually more of a pragmatist, maybe a little more negative about things, that person has to take on the role of optimist in order to stretch a little bit. And that person has to come up with a solution very quickly to that problem. And then a new problem for that solution, a new solution for that new problem, and vice versa, back and forth. Just toss it back and forth 4 or 5 times. This is a great way to start digging into the nitty-gritty of what can happen. That's the anticipation portion of this. The implementation ideally can come afterward. So pause the video, take your time, I'll be here. That should have been plenty of time if you paused it. And you can still pause it if you want to. But now that we're back, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to dig very briefly into the idea and concepts behind finished successes. We have a unit that can go into this in more detail with the company Pedagogic Advisor, and we would love to be able to work with your school remotely or in person, depending on what works best. If it's something that you think would be useful for your students, feel free in the links here at the end to check out those different videos that I've got for students, for parents, and drop us a line at timerepaircorp.com or through any of our social media channels. Like, share, and subscribe. Do the thing. YouTube likes everyone better when they do. And we'll see you all next time. I look forward to not only seeing what you do with your students, but to ideally being able to work with your school and integrate some of your best practices into Zero to Civ for the future. Thank you very much for taking the time, and I'll talk to you again next time.